Hello and welcome to another episode of the Duct Tape Marketing Podcast. This is John Jantsch. My guest today is Kai Anderson. He's a seasoned strategist who started with his own company and now leading workforce transformation for Mercer, has spent years guiding organizations throughout Europe. His book, Digital Human, championed the concept of prioritizing humans in the digital transformation. And today we're going to talk about his new book, Work Different, 10 Truths for Winning in the People Age. So Kai, welcome to the show.
Thanks much, John. Great to be here with you.
So I always like to pick apart titles and subtitles particularly. And so let's start with People Age. How do you describe this thing you're calling the People Age?
I'm glad you're picking that, John, because, in fact, the idea was that the initial title was the People Age, but we turned it around. So why is it the People Age? We had some major trends evolving in the past, like 50 years, which brought us from the industrial age into another age. Some people argue it's the digital age. We say it's the people age, right? And of course, we have some like short-term events like the pandemic, that also accelerated some of these trends.
So what are some aspects that make this? I mean, you referenced the industrial age. What are the aspects that make this the people age?
John, the industrial age was very much the core paradigm of the industrial age was command and control. And that worked pretty well. And we have to see that employers and employees were not on eye level. So, this was like, as we see still in some organizations like military, that was a different kind of organizing work. And it was a different relationship. And that has changed significantly through, of course, demographics, right? Now that we all face labor shortage, things have turned around, values have shifted. So that is something which is very different to what we've seen in the industrial age, where we are now coming towards, a balance of power, if you would like to say so, where we are coming to a new kind of relationship between employers and employees, or contributors, as we say.
Yeah. So the book also unveils 10 truths. I'm not going to ask you to name your favorite truth or name all 10 truths, but I wonder if there's one or maybe two that you would say, hey, these are the most significant things, or these are the things people get wrong the most in this age.
It really starts with, John, what I just mentioned, the contributors. So the first chapter is Goodbye Employee, Hello Contributor. And I think we need to get rid of the idea of an employee. People want to contribute. They want to bring their very best to work, and they want acknowledgement for that. And that is something that has changed a lot. I guess when we started working, right, it was all about getting a good paycheck, and that was it, right? And that has changed dramatically. So the contributor, and we see that in our global talent trends. You might know that we do like annual, of course, surveys on what is trending and what people expect. And more than 40% of people say that they want appreciation for that, what they bring to work, for their contribution. So that is a very important chapter. One of my favorites. It's the first one. Of course, I have others.
And I also like the use of new language too, because I think a lot of times old language, employee, is kind of loaded with how people think about that. And I think it probably in some cases almost takes an entire, you mentioned paradigm, almost a paradigm shift of what an employee or the term employee even is.
Absolutely.
So you also mentioned the pandemic, and it's hard to talk about any kind of thing around team and staffing without bringing it up. Hopefully we'll grow out of that at some point. But remote work certainly has been around for a period of time, but talk about accelerating that. It's certainly changed a lot of organizations dramatically. How does the people age, how do the 10 truths really relate to the idea that so many people now are not physically, in a building with their place of employment?
I'm glad you're asking. We have a dedicated chapter on that. It's called the New Rhythm of Work. And that is, by the way, we have a lot of musical references. So if you're not into music, you might not like the book, right? But if you're into music, we have a lot of references here. And the New Rhythm of Work is like, the good thing. If there was one good thing about the pandemic, then it was that it showed us what is possible with regard to working virtually. And in the end, in the beginning, it worked out pretty well. But then we kind of struggled, and organizations started to struggle because we were getting out of sync, right? So some people were starting early, others were starting late, some were commuting, others were working from home. So we're not in sync anymore. And that is why some companies, are calling people back into their offices, which is, of course, not the answer, because the ghost is out of the bottle, right? You cannot turn it back. But we need to kind of find that new rhythm. We need to kind of get back in sync with each other to make that entire thing work.
If the workplace is changing, if organizations are realizing this is the people age, what are leadership? How does leadership have to change? Does training need to change? Do who we think of as a leader need to change? Certainly the hierarchical, structure of leadership has to change. What do you tell people now when they're trying to think, how do we develop leaders in our organization in this kind of new age?
First of all, leaders should read our book, John. Obviously, of course.
Yes, well, that, of course.
Of course. Because no, I think the book is not targeted at like HR people, not primarily. It's targeted at leaders, at executives. Right. It's targeted at people that want to understand how this new world of working is working and what it takes. And I think we have some really great, advice also for leaders in here. Let me take one or two things.
Okay.
The basics of good leadership have not changed, not really, right? Being on eye level, these kind of things, right? So but of course, there are things that are new. And let me take empathy, for example. Empathy is something that has really emerged strongly with the pandemic, because we had to put, we had to get into, the other's shoes, right? Really understand what is bothering you, how do you feel? And that kind of notion, think back 30 years ago, that would have been impossible, right? But now it's a leadership competency we're talking about. So, and empathy is the beginning of inclusion, right? And what we all want is, a diverse and inclusive workforce. So the basis for that is empathy. So we're drawing the line here to make sure that people understand what is good leadership about, what has changed, and what do you need to know as a leader in the people age.
So there were a couple terms that were certainly used throughout the U.S. I'm not sure if they were used as much in Europe, quiet quitting and the great resignation, where things of, where people were up and leaving, choosing other jobs. And I think a lot of people initially kind of pegged that as, people just don't want to work anymore. But I think what really came out of that was people just don't want to work for you anymore, or at this place, right? So how does this real sort of desire for engagement, for well-being, in the place that they work, manifest itself?
It's also something that is, has very much been accelerated by the pandemic.
Yes.
Because, we were sitting in our homes, we were like, considering and thinking about, what's life about, and what do I expect from life, and what do I expect from work? What do I expect from my employer? Yeah. Right. And so it wasn't really surprising that people, in the pandemic and after the pandemic thought like, is that it? Or is there more to it? And what am I going to do? And of course, we have to be fair, John. This was fueled to some extent by the labor market situation. Of course, when I can change like this,
right?
That's not that much of an issue. I think it's now a bit harder, and the Great Resignation has stopped, as a movement. But also here, I think we see a genuine shift of preferences with people, and we see people asking for purpose, right? For purpose of their companies, for purpose, in their lives, and I think that's a good movement.
So you already mentioned diversity and inclusion. I think that workplaces have become more diverse generationally, I think, which is probably driving some of this. You think of some of what we've talked about has really been attributed to millennials, I want to work at a place that matters, necessarily, that's higher than what I'm paid maybe. Talk a little bit about, I know you have a whole chapter on diversity and inclusion, and not as a regulatory process, and more of a people want to work in companies that value that.
That is also some of the, shift in preferences that we're seeing that is very much tied to, I want to bring myself to work. I want to be looked at as an individual, right? That entire idea of the workforce, the human resource is a very abstract thing.
Yeah.
And that is not, John, we're living in a world of hyper individualization, right? People want to be seen as an individual. I have been working with the former CHRO from Deutsche Lufthansa, Bettina Volkens. And she's a great woman. I did my last book with her, and she said, everybody wants to be seen. That was her mantra. Everybody wants to be seen.
Yeah.
With an airline, imagine, that is so true, isn't it? Right? And that is the genuine idea of inclusion and diversity.
So how do the truths that you share in this book or the insights you share in this book, help people create a more inclusive environment, help people be more seen?
I think it's the combination. And I think it starts with the general idea of this people age that has come. And we have a dedicated chapter on AI and technology, right? But the idea is it starts with the people. And if you consider that, when you ask executives, what's your most valuable resource? What will they answer? It's the people.
Yeah.
It's the people. But that has been a lip service, John,
right,
for years and years. Now it's becoming true. Now people start realizing it is the most valuable resource. And that is the first thing I think that needs to not necessarily change, but that needs to be top of people's mind to say it's the people that will make us successful or not. So, and it's the diversity of people that will make us more successful. And we have studies on that, right? We know that diverse teams are, better performing than non-diverse teams. So we know that. And I think you don't have to argue about that anymore. The question is, in fact, how do you do it?
Right. So you mentioned AI. That was my very next question, because there's certainly a lot of hand-wringing in some circles just about the idea that AI is going to replace people, that robots, are going to replace people. So how do you leverage technology? Because we also know that this technology sometimes affords us some great things. So how do you leverage technology with also then keeping some sort of human touch?
John, I'm a big tech fan, frankly, and I'm a big believer of, technology being an amplifier for our capabilities, which is why the chapter on AI we call Intelligence is Amplified, right? So we see it as an amplifier for our intelligence. And you mentioned the gains, right? We're talking 10 to 30% productivity increase. So this is incredible, especially if we consider that the past years, have been, stagnating with regard to productivity increase, right? So here's the kind of boost that we all want. And I see it as a means, or we see it in the book, as something that is highly beneficial for the organization, of course, but also for the contributor, for people within the organization, if we manage to kind of what we call, have a fair distribution of the digital dividend.
I know in my organization, most of the members of our team are fit into the millennial generation age-wise. And one of the things that I find is very valuable to them, they always want to continue to learn. Like what we talk about it every week. What'd you learn this week? What's a new thing you can share this week? How do you cultivate that kind of culture without also kind of cramming stuff down people's throats? It's like you have to keep learning, you have to keep training, you have to keep, reading. How do you create that in a way that feels very natural?
That's a cultural thing first, and look at Microsoft. They did an entire campaign on learn it all versus know it all, and look at where they are, right? So to me, that is first of all really cultural development, and you need to get to a culture that first of all is about curiosity, being curious, right? Trying new things, exploring things. I think we have cultural differences when we look at the US versus Europe versus Asia. Europeans are much more hesitating when it comes to new technology. That's different in different parts of the world. But start with the chances first, have that kind of curiosity. And then it's about, of course, embedding learning into everyday work, giving people the tools, giving people also some time. And most importantly, having the freedom to fail, right? So what we call psychological safety, create that psychological safety, say, you try, it goes wrong, doesn't matter. You're not supposed to do it wrong twice, right? But once is okay.
Yeah, right. So I'm sure you get this question, especially in a consulting role. If you're talking to a CEO, you're talking about change in some instances. This is not how every business is run, right, today. So you're talking about some significant change, sometimes equates to significant investment. So how do you help people realize the return on an investment in their people like we're talking about? Is there a way to measure like this has been successful?
Good question, John. When we're embarking on these exercises, the first thing that we make sure is, we're not really convincing people of like the return of investment, but rather, is it the right thing to do? So is there you want to get more profitable, right? Where does it stop? What are you going to do without like the kind of performance mindset, right? You want to be more innovative, you want to be more customer centered. Is that a structural thing or is that a mindset kind of thing? So this is, first of all, you believe it or not. And there are people that don't believe it, right? That rather want to get into structures, into processes and say,
Sure.
this is not about people. But more and more people buy into the idea of, at least people have something to do with it. So I'm not saying that of course, we're setting objectives like net promoter scores, there's a whole bunch of objectives and we're doing extensive employee listening to see what arrives, with employees, with contributors. Yeah. So this is something, and in the end, of course, you want to, see like the business results of all of that, but it's cause and effect. I know, and we know, we have great examples also in the book from organizations that managed to kind of become like a digital champion, for example, right? By at least investing heavily into their people, into their cultures, into their people practices. There's the hardwired stuff as well. There's objective setting, incentive systems, performance management, you name it. Of course, that plays a role.
I suspect if you want to default, or what I would default maybe as a simple metric is retention too. That's,
yes.
So many people left companies they didn't like working for, and it was very expensive to replace them.
Retention is, meanwhile, retention is a business objective.
Exactly.
Just as diversity is, just as engagement. Of course, you're absolutely right.
Well, Kai, I appreciate you taking a moment to stop by the Duct Tape Marketing Podcast. You want to invite people where they might connect with you, obviously find a copy of your latest book, Work Different.
John, thank you so much. Yeah, please reach out. LinkedIn, great channel. Make sure that we follow you, John. Great talking to you. Good fun.
Yeah, awesome. Again, thanks for stopping by. Hopefully we'll run into you one of these days out there in Europe.